Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. Well, we promised you on our last podcast that we were going to have a return guest because of his great wisdom that he shared with us on our last podcast. We'd like to welcome back to the show Dr. Curt Thompson. Curt is a psychiatrist, a speaker, a great author who connects our intrinsic desire to be known with the need to tell truer stories about ourselves. He is the author of The Soul of Shame and Anatomy of the Soul. We had such a great conversation with him on our last podcast. Today, we'd like to address shame as it relates to the community of men that come to us at Faithful and True. Welcome again, Curt Thompson. Curt, good morning.
Randy, great to be with you. Always a pleasure to have the chance to have a conversation with you.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, and as Randy said, we want to take this podcast and talk specifically about the relationship between shame and addiction. And, we at Faithful and True work specifically with men who struggle with sexual addiction, and we also work with their wives and work with couples. But what we also acknowledge is there's a variety of different ways that addictive behavior shows up for both men and women. And what's true is many of the women or many of the men that we work with also have other addictions beyond the sexual addiction. So in your work, working with people, like, how do you understand that relationship between shame and addiction?
Well, Greg, this is, I'll just say this, and not to be too self-aggrandizing, but I have another book that's coming, a new book that's coming in the fall, and its title is The Soul of Desire, Discovering the Neuroscience of Longing, Beauty, and Community. And to get to your question, I think I would start with this notion. We begin with the question of what were we made for? And the vision of God for what we were initially made for is one in which we are deeply known by each other and by God, but not just for us to sit around and eat bonbons.
Right.
No, we are known in order for us to steward the earth, and in our way to be like God's image means that we create like God creates. We are deeply known in order to create beauty and goodness in the world. We are made to make beautiful things. And those things happen across the spectrum of life experience. It's not just artwork, though those folks are the vanguard of this, but it's also software and great bread and all the things that we make. But one of the things that happens is that with our wounding, evil uses shame as a way not just to make us feel bad about ourselves, not just to destroy our inner selves and our communities, but evil wields it in order to prevent us from creating beauty on the earth. And so addiction becomes a way in which, as evil pointed to the woman and said, look at the fruit, like it's like God just doesn't want you to have this wound of God doesn't really love you as much as you think he does, makes the fruit suddenly very attractive, not just because of the fruit on its own accord, but because it becomes a way for me to cope with the wound. But the taking, notice she had been given, she could receive all of everything else that was in the garden, but now she's going to take. We're going to take something, which is what we do with addiction. I take something and make it mine. I hoard it. I devour it instead of receiving it as a gift. But when I consume it and it disappears, the feeling, that dopamine, oxytocin rush that I get with my idolatry, that I get with my pornography, that I get with my cocaine, that feeling diminishes very, very quickly. And we know that what the brain's going to do, it's going to do two things. Number one, it's going to feel the drop, and my mind will very quickly be drawn once again to the shame that is driving the process. And the antidote for that shame, of course, will be to re-up and just do it even harder the next time around. I'm going to want to do this. And what does this do? It continues to disintegrate my world. It disintegrates my mind. It disintegrates my relationships. But the other thing that it does that we don't think about is that it shears off my capacity to create those artifacts that have been waiting for me from before the foundation of the world, that God, this good and beautiful thing that God wants me to create with him in the world. And so it's not just that my addiction is a problem, it is also something that prevents me from creating the beauty that God is waiting to have happen in the world.
Yeah. One of the things that we talk about, you mentioned how shame played such a significant role. And one of the things that can happen is, for a lot of people, they're trying to shame their way into recovery. That if I tell myself enough that I'm worthless, that I'm a loser, that I'm pathetic, that I'm weak, that maybe that lie will motivate me to do recovery. But actually the shame guarantees that I will act out again, because the acting out, we talk about when I'm in that fog of lust, I get a temporary reprieve from the shame.
Exactly. One of the things that we see that happens neurobiologically with that process of shaming myself for my behavior and for my character and so forth is not unlike what we see in other experiences of human life. So, for instance, you'll notice that if you're having some kind of painful experience in your body that is so bad, you would even elect to have a different painful place, someplace else in your body, as a way to distract you from the overwhelming pain of where you experience it right now. This is all the case of what happens with people who cut themselves, right? I'm cutting myself. It's a painful experience, but it distracts me from the pain that I'm experiencing internally, emotionally. The problem, of course, is that the very act of cutting, the very act of shaming as a way to overwhelm the felt sense of shame, of course, only reinforces my awareness. The very act itself is an act of shame. It's just distracting me from the present feeling of it. Mm-hmm. And then when I pause and I back up, I've just added more weight to the payload of shame that I now carry around with me. And hence, because addictive behavior is often something to which I can appeal and access quickly, and I can't really tolerate my awareness of how long it would take to unload this load of shame. It's not just that the addiction is attractive, it is that its temporal nature, the speed, the swiftness with which it moves, is also something that drives my behavior toward it, only unwittingly reinforcing the very shame activity that has started it in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that idea that the way that we talk about addiction is addiction occurs anytime we're trying to meet a legitimate need in an illegitimate way in a repetitive pattern. Mm-hmm. And the illusion of the addiction is temporarily, it appears as if the need is met. We also talk about this idea that addiction or lust is a person drinking salt water thinking they're going to be satisfied. Well, it appears as if it's going to meet my need. It appears as if it's going to satisfy me, but on the back end, I'm actually thirstier. And that continues that perpetuation. But if it wasn't a half-truth, it wouldn't be as powerful.
Exactly. As we say, like most people, if you're at your home this afternoon at 3:00 in the afternoon and the devil shows up and says, hey, let's go rob a bank, you're probably not going to do that. That's probably not how it's going to work. It's going to work in half-truths. It's going to work in the very ways that you're talking about. I also think what's really, and to say, like, it should be said, and I know that you say this in your work, this is the hardest work you'll ever do. Mm-hmm. There isn't any more difficult work. People think that the hardest work is to put up with, what I feel instead of like giving into the addiction. No, the hardest work you're going to do is the work of recovery. It is the hardest work, but it is also, like we say, about anaerobic versus aerobic activity of the body. If I really need to get someplace quickly and I'm terribly out of shape, I might run those 3 miles. And the next week, I'm going to be like in terrible pain because like I need to get someplace quickly. But that's very different than deciding, I want to be in really great shape. And so I'm going to take the long road and I'm not going to get into shape in a day. I'm not going to get into shape in the 30 minutes that it takes me to run 3 miles. I'm going to get into shape over a period of 6 to 12 weeks. It's going to be a long road in the same direction, all of obedience. And this, of course, is where part of the lie that takes place in the garden is that there is a relationship that emerges between the snake and the woman. She is having a relationship, but it's a limited one. It's between her and only one other person. Right? It's interesting that our Christian theology has emerged in such a way that we talk about a Trinitarian God. We don't talk about just one. We don't talk about two. We talk about this three-person God because we recognize that love, in order for it to be in its fullness, requires at least three people. This is why marriages, Christian marriage, is between a male and a female and the Holy Spirit. This is why communities for recovery are not just two people. It's not that much for two people to become really quite self-satisfied with each other. But you throw a third person in the mix and now I got to do all kinds of extra work. But this is hard, long work. And this is why the relational aspect that we're talking about that is so important and necessary for the healing of shame is so different than just me saying, well, I'm just going to grin. I'm just going to white knuckle this. I'm just going to tell myself that I don't have anything to be ashamed of anymore. Or for to just have one person tell me that. But for me to be in a room where I recognize that the healing antidote for shame is not merely cutting it out, but it is the creation of the presence of community, the creation of the presence of folks who can help me name what's underneath my shame, what's underneath my addiction. Who are the people who are going to ask of me, Curt, what are your longings? Where do you need to be seen, soothed, safe, secure? Where is that addiction trying to take up residence for that, where relationships have not taken place, where you've been actually wounded when it comes to being seen, soothed, safe, and secure? Those whole elements out of which my addictions tend to grow, because I haven't had the experience of people who've been coming to find me and giving me a completely different neurobiological and interpersonal paradigm within which I can begin to live.
One of the things we talk about that community is this idea that community is a part of our DNA. It's a part of the intentionality of God's creation. It's the one thing that God declared wasn't good about creation is that people would be alone. And so to live outside of community is actually living outside of the intention of God. And we talk about recovery in the terms of it's not about giving up a behavior, it's about becoming the person that God created you to be. The giving up the behavior is just a means to an end. I can't be that person if I'm held hostage by a behavior, but it's so much more. And AA talks about the dry drunk. How do you encourage people to move beyond just stopping a behavior to living into the truth, the reality of who God created them to be?
Well, one of the things that that happen in the confessional community in our practice is this notion that we can give people a construct and say, well, here are the things that you need to do, to fix your problem. But that's a different thing than being in a community in which we give people the practice, give people the experience of answering the questions. Where are you? What do you want? Can you drink the cup? There's another question, right? We want to hear about what people want. And, if the addiction is how I love that definition in which that addiction is, trying to appropriate a certain behavior on a legitimate longing with an illegitimate behavior. And how do I even know what that longing is? How do I even, because most of us don't even know what those things are.
Right.
The addictions themselves have so overpowered that all I know is that I'm just now here for the hit. I don't even know what's underneath the hit. What's underneath? What is it that I'm longing for? And so one of the things that we think is important is for people to be in places where they are asking and are being asked on a regular basis, where are you and what do you want? What is it that you're longing for, even right here and now?
And what's interesting is my experience working with a lot of Christian men is in the church, they've been taught to not trust their longings, that desires and longings are always suspicious. And we're supposed to act as if we don't have needs. And so one of the most difficult parts of this journey is to get able to be present with myself enough that I can name my needs and my longings, and it not even be about my shame.
Exactly.
A lot of the groups that we have, we start or we encourage them to identify what are your needs today. And in the beginning of that conversation, it's like they have no language around needs because they've been taught to survive. Needs are a luxury, so I have to set those aside. Or if I get clear about my desires, then the church may be giving me a message that those are wrong. So I try to live where I don't have needs, and I try to live where I don't have desires.
I'm guessing you find this when people are in the, the foothills of the mountain that they're climbing that we call recovery. This notion, I can only imagine what you just talked about, this idea that when we ask, what do you want? What are your longings? I've had people look at me like I have two heads. Like, my longing is to not be depressed. My longing is to stop drinking. My longing is, I can name all these, that's obvious about what's wrong with my life that I want to go away. But that's very different than naming, what is it about my life that I don't have that I really want? What is the beauty that I really long to create? I don't know. I'm just too busy trying to get through my freaking day. Mm-hmm. To think about those kinds of things requires way too much of me because I don't have much practice relationally being seen, soothed, created to be safe and secure, to adventure out, to take the kind of risks that God wants me to take. And so in the early stages, it's quite a feat, I think, for people to become comfortable, and it requires practice. It requires, people sitting in our groups and asking, tell me, what do you want? And we're waiting for 20, 30 seconds, silence, because they can't find it. And we will say, this is not easy to do. Right. This is not easy. And evil is counting on you not answering this question. I think it's really, to me, it's really striking to me that Jesus' first words recorded in the book of John, in the Gospel of John, are, what do you want? When he asks John the Baptist's disciples, when they come for him, when they come to follow after him, what do you want? What are you looking for? And, you see their answer, right? Their answer, and maybe this is the proper, deference that is required of a rabbi, that they say, well, where are you living? And I'm thinking, the guy's trying to have a real conversation. He's asking you a real question. What do you want to know where I'm living? That's what you want to know? That's right. All you want?
Yeah,
in much the same way that God comes to Adam and Eve. Where are you? Like, it's a real God who wants real conversation. And part of our difficulty is that we've grown up in the church not having the experience. As you said earlier, Greg, like, this notion of experience is such a crucial element that I can't just have this locked into my mind as head knowledge, but it must be embodied experience with others who are coming to find me. And in that process, not allowing shame to occupy airspace. And when it does, for us to name it and say, yes, shame wants me to not tell you what I want because I'm afraid I'm going to feel ashamed when I do.
Right. We teach the story of Jesus encountering the paralytic at the pool of Bethesda. And what we talk about is the question that Jesus asked, do you want to be well, is a question of desire. And this idea that I think Jesus knew what you desired, you pursue, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, whether it's in a redemptive way or a destructive way. Our GPS is set towards the desire. So that intentionality, that if we can say, this is what is good and redemptive, and I desire that, then I will be set to pursue it, versus being afraid of it.
Exactly. I think that, one of the other things we talk an awful lot about, the two rails of what we call the temporal domain of the mind, how we as humans are able to actually think about time differently than other animals do. And there are two rails of time that we run on. One rail is a more passive rail, and that's where we would say, in the past, our imagination runs to regret, and in the future, it runs to anxiety and rumination. When it comes to the more active rail, the more present rail, the more intentional rail, the future planning. I'm planning something, I'm thinking about the future, but I'm doing work right now that must be done right now for that. Or if I'm reflecting on the past, I'm thinking about the past on purpose for the purpose of inviting God to reveal things. So for instance, when we're in our groups and we're going to tell people about our story, and I'm telling you about my dad, I'm reflecting on my past with an intention for creating beauty and goodness in the world, in the here and now. Shame wants us staying on that first rail. It keeps us in that place where we are more passive. And so one of the things that we talk with folks about is you always know that shame is lurking around somewhere when you find yourself too long being anxious of the future and being regretful of the past. And when that takes place, you also know that you are now disconnected from relationship, right? Most of our planning and most of our reflecting, when it's done most effectively, is done with other people.
Right.
If we're going to plan for the vacation or whatever. Yeah.
And I also hear that one of the other notes that pay attention to is when I'm living a life of passivity, that's an indication that I'm in shame. When I'm choosing to live intentionally, that's when I'm living in truth. And what is true for those of us who struggle with addiction, comprehensively, our life can be about passivity, simply responding to what's coming our way. But when it comes to that may be intentionally to pursue that which is most destructive.
It is. And what's so striking about it is that in the same way that Eve pursued the fruit, the context is that there is this dialed in kind of monovision for what we're looking at, as opposed to a broader vision. I'm pursuing something, right? So when I pursue pornography, I'm not thinking about anybody else. I don't have other interpersonal relational connections in mind. When I'm pursuing, doing this podcast with you, like I'm pursuing you. The podcast, the beauty of the podcast becomes the byproduct of the pursuit of relationship. When people create great art, look, I know that there's all the stories about Van Gogh and how like most of his art was like not discovered until after he was long dead. And but I can guarantee you that when you read the letters, it's not as if the guy wasn't interested in people seeing his art.
Right.
And when we go to a Van Gogh show, like I don't want to just go by myself and have a private show. No, I want to take you with me. And I want us to see it together. And then I want us to go have dinner together. And I want us to talk about this because the beauty itself is creating deeply connected human relationships that themselves are the artifacts of the beauty that we've just witnessed.
And I even think one of the ways that movement towards beauty is showing up is there seems to be a surge in outdoor activity. Maybe that's driven by the pandemic, but I think it was way before then. So we have all these companies that are providing us with outdoor gear. But I think that there's something that draws us intuitively towards the beauty of nature. And we want to see that thing and really see is not the right word. We want to experience the beauty of God's creation, knowing that in some way that is healing and redemptive, and it transcends whatever the circumstances might be in my life in that moment.
Absolutely. We like to think that beauty shows up generally in the human, library. If we look at the human experience, beauty typically shows up in 3 different domains of life. It shows up, of course, in the arts. It shows up in nature. It begins in nature, right? That's where it first shows up. It begins in nature. And then we have our artists who are developing that. And then it shows up in religious experience. Those are the places where it also most powerfully shows up. Those things that we are creating that are not explicitly artistic in and of themselves. But what I suggest that we see in the biblical narrative is that those are 3 forms of beauty that we encounter that are pointing us to the reality that the entire experience of humanity is to be understood and experienced in this way, that relationally, we are being created as objects of great beauty, that we aren't just good when we aren't just right, We aren't just like righteous in God's eyes, but that we are artifacts of beauty. That when the new heaven and new earth arrives, God will point to us and say, my gosh, Greg, you're one of the most beautiful people I've seen. And of course, look at you. I'm gonna like you're like looking around and thinking like, are you talking to me? Like, because no, he's not a thing I think when I think of me.
Right.
And yet, this is exactly what our God is trying to say to us.
Well, we think beauty is about appearance versus being a being. That the beauty is in the being combined with the physical self that God has created. And we have reduced beauty just to something visual. And, one of the things that I experience in my own life and encourage other men is that beauty has a way to connect us to God, but beauty also has a way to get us present with ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
If a man is struggling getting present with his emotional self, I encourage him to experience beauty, whether it's through art or nature or even some sort of creative movie. Because if we are in beauty and something meaningful, it connects us with the part of ourselves that we detach from.
Right. And I would just support that for our listeners. I just think that's such a real, one of the questions that we ask now is, how are you on a daily basis putting yourself on the path of oncoming beauty? How do you qualify that? Like all things, beauty is something that, like the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is something my darker side will look at any moment to try to hijack.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're not just talking about beauty, because pornography, it is images of beautiful people.
Right.
But what I'm doing with that beauty is that I am devouring it. I am manipulating it. But if I were to walk out my front door, I'm looking out my window now at this oak tree in my neighborhood, is probably at least 80 years old. Like I have no words for that. Like that thing falls over, it pancakes me. Like me versus the tree wins. Me versus my car, the tree wins. If I encounter that reminds me that beauty is something that is so beyond me that it reminds me too of a God whose strength is also coming to find me.
Mm-hmm.
But his strength is coming to find me in his very vulnerability. He's not coming to pancake me. He's not coming to ruin me. He's coming to be in relationship with me, a relationship nonetheless that will also have its great and beautiful demands.
Right. Well, and what I hear you saying is it's about stewarding the beauty, and you use the word hijack. It's not about hijacking the beauty for my agenda, my own attempt to meet my legitimate needs in illegitimate ways, but it's embracing beauty and stewarding the beauty to move me more towards becoming the person that God wants me to be. So
Exactly.
Gentlemen, that was you guys put a perfect bow on this podcast just in those last comments. Curt, we can't thank you enough for having joined us today on the Faithful and True podcast. Your wisdom, your experience, and your eloquence is inspiring. And it's been our joy to have you on the show. We hope that we can do this again in the near future. You're the kind of guest that our listeners, our viewers, our community is totally going to embrace your very spiritual and uplifting message. So we thank you sincerely for being with us today.
Well, Randy, thank you for inviting me. Greg, it's great to chat. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Great. Once again, we'd like to thank you for joining the Faithful and True podcast today. As we announced last week on our show, we're happy to announce that the COVID restrictions have been lifted in our state to the point that we can start offering the Men of Valor 3-day intensive workshops in person, beginning with our July workshop. Check our website, faithfulandtrue.com, for the details about the upcoming workshops. June will be our next and last, for the foreseeable future, June will be our last virtual workshop by way of Zoom technology. If that is something that you desire or works out best for your schedule, you can register right online. Until then, we invite you to visit our YouTube channel, Faithful and True channel, and give us your support and your likes. We really appreciate you doing that. Until we join you again, we hope that this coming week for you is going to be a week that's filled with many blessings and great vision.